Today on The Future of Everything, the future of fairness in computational systems. We hear a lot about big data and its power in providing insight about patterns that we might not be able to perceive. These patterns can be literally patterns in images where AI systems can see things that we miss. They can be patterns in text to help understand language. In my work, we look at patterns in DNA that might be relevant to your health. We can also look for patterns in human behavior, including patterns in how people make decisions. This can be treacherous. A decision maker might think they are always evaluating just the data and making the best decision free from bias. But sometimes the big data, or even the little data, might suggest otherwise. Stanford psychologist Amos Tversky and his colleague Daniel Kahneman 10, 20, 30 years ago wrote extensively about human decision-making and all the biases and foibles that it can manifest. They classified these biases, and in fact, during my medical training, we were specifically taught all the ways we could think we were making good, unbiased decisions when we weren't. And we got the message. But analysis of data about human behavior is critical for marketing, and so many tech companies have gotten very good at it. Political campaigns have gotten remarkably good at understanding human decision-making and how to manipulate it. But there's another important application, which is looking at data to assess important human decisions, such as in the justice system. Do police make decisions based on evidence and data alone, or do they show biases? And are these biases damaging or good? What about judges deciding on bail or on the chance that a criminal will commit a crime again in the future? Are social services distributed in a fair way by those who decide who gets help from the government and who doesn't? Sharad Goel is a professor of management science and engineering and computer science and law at Stanford University. He is the founder of the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, and he helped create the Stanford Open Policing Project. Sharad, you have worked in many diverse fields such as voter fraud, racial discrimination, online privacy, criminal justice, and others. Is there an area where you believe bias in human decisions is doing the most damage?
I hate these questions. I mean, all of these places, either it's clearly a problem. I primarily am working in criminal justice these days, and here, everywhere you look, the outcomes, the decisions are so consequential, and the bias is everywhere, from police, from the courts to corrections, that I feel like this is just, to me, this is a very important area.
So I want to get a very important issue right away, which is, does bias equal bad? Are they one and the same? If I find bias in a decision maker, does that label that decision maker as a bad decision maker, or do we have to be in some way a little bit more careful in how we characterize bias?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. So I hate the word bias. I don't think it means much. I mean, I think in many ways we think of it as a synonym for bad, but really the question is, are these good or bad? Not good or bad in a moral sense, but in a policy sense. Like, are these decisions that we're happy with, that we're unhappy with? And that, to me, is the most important thing. But bias, I mean, there's some sort of things, like if I'm like clearly racist, like obviously that's bad. But most things are much more subtle than that. And so that's really it. So I do think they're separate issues.
I would imagine then when you do studies, and we'll talk about it in a few moments, but when you do studies of like police, the statistics of police stops and stop and frisk or stop and examine, that I'm sure that the people who are defending the police say that these police have a lot of experience, they have intuitions, they've been on the front lines, and that what we're calling bias or uneven distribution of their decision making is actually a refined, highly honed sense that they've learned on the job. What do we say to those kinds of arguments?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important not to discount experience. I mean, certainly people who are officers who are on the street, they have years, sometimes decades of experience. We don't want to discount it. At the same time, it's hard for anybody in any profession to make decisions. I know, like, when I'm grumpy or hungry, I'm going to make bad decisions. I mean, this is just like the nature of being human. And there's some things that humans are good at, and there are many things that humans are not good at. So I think understanding those limitations is important. My sense is that it's, just like nobody likes to be called biased, right? And I don't think that framing is usually productive, especially when it's not explicit bias, which is usually what we're seeing. I mean, people are just making decisions. They're not out there intentionally necessarily to go do bad things. They're just acting in a way that they think is locally reasonable, but in many cases it turns out not to be, and that's what we're trying to detect and in many cases try to fix.
Yeah, so let's go down into the details of one of your studies. You're well known for looking at police decisions, and so could you describe kind of how you get the data, how you analyze it, and then how do you bring your conclusions to the various policymakers who could be able to act on it?
Yeah, so we have a long-standing interest in police decision making. So over the last 5 years, we went out and collected data from every state in the country. So there's no centralized repository of police data in the United States. I mean, this is actually pretty remarkable that this doesn't exist, that policing is in the news all the time, but you can't just like go to some federal agency and say, give me a list of everybody who's been stopped or give me any kind of aggregate statistics on this sort of thing. It doesn't exist. So we went out and we filed hundreds of requests for information, public records requests, and we got back in the end 200 million records of police stops after 5 years. We spent hundreds, thousands of hours cleaning the data, and in these last few weeks, actually, we ended our analysis. We finished the first phase of our analysis.
I just have to stop you. You made all of these requests, and I can't imagine that the municipalities are like, oh yeah, we get these requests all the time, here's the flash drive. So how much of a battle is it to get that data? I think you probably deserve some credit, and I'm trying to figure out exactly how much.
So I personally don't deserve any credit. These are all the students, the graduate students, the undergraduate students. They're all sorts of people.
Tenacious, I would guess.
Yes, tenacious is definitely one word for it. I mean, it's not a project that I'm sure I would do again. It was really extremely painful to do this. And yeah, if I actually knew ahead of time how hard this would be, I almost certainly would not do it.
Did it involve going to court at times with lawyers?
No, so we threatened, but it was all a bluff. Look, I'm a university professor. I'm not going to like go and sue somebody over this. I mean, briefly, I talked to somebody. We were having some trouble with one jurisdiction. I talked to some people at the ACLU, and I was like, look, this is like black letter law. They should give us the records. And they were like, yeah, you're completely right. There's no way they're going to give you the records. And I was like, well, what about if you like sue them? You're like, come on, we have better things to do. That this is
even the ACLU didn't want to sue.
They have lots of these are. And there's this funny equilibrium, and people know it's like that at the end it's there's some pressure, but really, if they really push back hard, what are we going to do? Okay. One of these states that we tried to get records from. They actually told us, well, we don't record the race of the people that we stop because we're not racist. So why would we record the race of the people that we stop? It's like okay,
There you go. Okay, I'm sorry. I had to ask that because it just sounds like a monumental task.
Oh yeah.
But let me let you go back to your narrative of how you did it and what you did.
So kind of 5 years in, we have hundreds of millions of stop records. This is the largest repository ever built. We actually released it recently, so anyone can go play with the data. And then we analyzed it, and we're particularly interested in evidence of bias in these routine types of traffic stops. And so typically when people talk about policing, what comes to mind are these egregious cases, and these certainly exist. They're kind of profoundly uncomfortable and distressing that this happens at all. But I think there's this other question of what happens in the everyday enactment of a traffic stop. And everybody probably, or at least, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't presume, I've been stopped by the police. Probably many of you have been stopped by the police at some point for driving too fast or something. And so what happens is...
I'm convinced that at any time I could be legitimately stopped by a police officer because of my unfamiliarity with the driving rules and the state of my car.
Oh yeah, that's completely... for a series of reasons, I had to retake the driving test recently. And I was a little bit scared. I was like...
Because you made too many freedom of information
I know. Something like that actually did happen, but I won't go down that path. But I basically could not pass that written test. It's surprisingly difficult.
Okay, back to the story. We have millions of records.
We have hundreds of millions of records, and now we're trying to understand: is there bias in these routine decisions, whether or not who you pull over, who you search once you pull them over? And the first thing is there are clearly disparities. So black drivers are pulled over much more often than white drivers relative to their share of the population. The problem is that that in and of itself doesn't tell us much about discrimination. It just tells us about disparities. And so now we have to do something much more complicated to figure out, is race really playing a role in that officer's decision to make a stop? And so here we lean pretty heavily on some results about 10 years ago, this very clever method for figuring out whether or not there's bias in traffic stops. So these researchers, they made this observation that at night, it's hard to tell somebody's race because there's this quote unquote veil of darkness. And during the day, you can see somebody's race. And so now you can use this fact that during the night, you can't really tell someone's race. During the day, you can tell someone's race to see whether or not race is affecting an officer's decision. But there's a catch. The catch is that it's dark at some times, like 9, 10 o'clock, and it's light at other times. And so what do? Well, you make the observation that we have things like daylight savings. And so all of a sudden, at the exact same time, there's this rapid switch between dark and light. And because of this, we can look at these differences right around daylight savings. And we can say, oh, well, it's 7 o'clock. Yesterday, it was light. Today, it's dark. Now, what happened to the share of drivers that were stopped that were white or black? And using this type of analysis, we actually found evidence of racial bias in that stop decision all across the country.
Now, what about confounding variables? So in medicine, we are always worried that we see an effect of a drug, but that drug might have been taken under different circumstances. There might have been different food taken by the patient. There's a lot of confounding variables. So I'm sure you're thinking, and I know you have statistical training, you're thinking about the confounders that are unmeasured that might also be explaining some of these effects. How do you think about that?
And at the end of the day, statistics is not physics. It's not going to give us answers that we're going to say with 99.999% precision, this is what's going on. And so there's always this level of uncertainty. And so we can do these things which are these things like this veil of darkness test, which tries to get around all these potential confounders. But at the end, there's uncertainty, and that's part of this. And it's not, it's not the same thing as these types of other scientific fields where we just feel like we have the answer at the end of the day. Here, there's always this we don't really know. We're just piecing together all the parts.
This is the future of everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Sharad Goel about, well, in this case, about discrimination and bias based on data in traffic stops. And you've extended this work to other elements of the criminal justice system. And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So. Well, a lot of our work is trying to understand when these types of disparities exist and what might be driving it. But then another side of our work is trying to fix some of these issues. And so one of the areas that we've been active in is in the courts. And so typically in the US, after someone's been arrested, about 1 or 2 days after someone's been arrested, a judge has to make this high-stakes decision about whether or not to detain or release that individual back in the community while a trial is pending. And this, remember, is done under presumption of innocence. Very little evidence is presented at that point. And traditionally, how these types of decisions are made is judge will call in the defendant and then look deep into their eyes and say, are you the type of person that will go out and commit a crime if I release you? And that, again, is based on experience. And I don't want to suggest that experience is invaluable. But when you look deeply at these things, you see all sorts of problems. And biases can kick in, just like random variation in which judge you happen to see. This can kick in one jurisdiction we looked at, one major jurisdiction across the US. One judge would release about 90% of the people that would come in front of them, and another about 50%. And these are kind of randomly assigned defendants. And so, but literally, there's a random number generator that says which judge you're going to go see. And if it turns up to be the harsh judge, well, there's a good chance that you're going to be detained, you're going to lose your job, you're going to be disconnected from your family, and another judge, you're going to go home, and that's it.
So let me just ask, first of all, before the big data came in, are there guidelines to try to get some reduction in the variation across judges, or was it entirely left to their judgment? It's
a good question. And so there loose guidelines. I mean, by law in most jurisdictions, there are certain factors that you're supposed to consider, for example, flight risk or public safety, but that's about it. And so this is why we see all of this variation.
And also, before you got on the scene, was there any sort of quantitative feedback to the judge about judge, you're releasing a heck of a lot of people, or judge, you're putting a lot of people in jail? Was there anything like that? I know that lawyers are always aware of this. My wife's an attorney, and they know the tough judges and the I don't want to say easy judges. They know the different behavioral features of different judges, but I don't know if it was ever fed back to these judges.
I don't know if it's any systematic way. I mean, probably some judges out there, they know and have been told, but as far as I know, there's no systematic effort to inform judges of what their decisions are. And this is one of the reasons that it's hard for humans to do anything without this type of feedback, that we're just like, judges are seeing dozens, hundreds of these cases every year. They don't know what happens. They don't know if the people they release end up committing a crime. They don't even know these basic statistics about what they're doing. So it's hard. It's hard to make decisions under those contexts.
Okay, so now go back. So now you looked at these judges, you found some disparate behavior, but you were talking about interventions. So I'm ready for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah, so what we're now trying to do is build algorithms. I hate this word algorithms because it sounds scary and complicated. Really, this is a note card that says, here are a few factors that you should consider. For example, someone's past history of failing to appear at court, their past criminal history, these types of things, and gives some guidance to what is going to happen if this person is actually released. And what we found is that in many of these jurisdictions, you could release about 30% more people without increasing any threat to public safety, without increasing the number of people that fail to appear at trial.
Now, was this done on a retrospective basis, and have you had the opportunity yet to say, okay, let's try this in the wild and see if it works?
Oh, so this was done retrospectively, and now we're trying to roll these things out, and we'll see what happens. And so, like we're talking with Jeremy about, this is hard. That we did the statistics on the historical data, but we don't know what's going to happen going forward.
Are the various decision makers open to this kind of intervention? It sounds like they might be. So when you go to a bunch of judges and say, hey, we think you might be able to improve your performance, with all due respect, Your Honor, and here's some data, how do they respond to that?
Well, I mean, like anything, there's variance, right? So some people are not interested, but I think many people are. And
probably the ones who lock everybody up don't want to hear about it. And the ones who are letting everybody go are all open to learning.
So I'm usually the cynical one. That's
sorry,
ridiculous.
that's a terrible thing for me to say.
So again, maybe I'm naive, but I genuinely think that all of these decision makers, they want to improve, they want to do the right thing, they want to have access to tools that will help them do a better job. And sometimes it is an uncomfortable conversation because people have been doing these things for years or decades, and now you're telling them, like literally, you probably locked up a lot of people. This is real. This isn't just like, I feel bad if I like misgrade a student's homework. This is like real. And people are losing their job. Again, they're disconnected from their family. This is real stuff, and they probably made a bad decision in many, many, many cases. Now, we have to look forward, and we say, well, what are we going to do going forward? Are we just going to ignore the problem, or are we going to do something about it? And I think many people, at least in my experience, are receptive to learning how they can improve.
So this is great, and as you consider making these interventions, what is your thoughts about informing and supporting the judge versus taking certain tasks away from them and making it a closed-loop automatic system? I mean, is there any role for these we have the same issues in medicine where we're saying, like, should you just advise the doctor, or you should just take it out of the doctor's hand and let a closed-loop system with control theory, et cetera, just handle it? And what are your senses about that?
Yeah, so this is a great question, the one that comes up all the time. So there's this story that I like to tell. It's this old analogy that was used in the 50s. So this was prior to a lot of the computation that we have these days. And you just imagine there's this computer that's trying to predict whether or not somebody's going to go to the movies. And it's like, great, it looks at all the historical data, it knows what's playing, all this stuff, and it does great. Now, all of a sudden, the person that you're making the prediction about breaks their leg. The neighbor says, oh, this person, no way they're going to the movies today. The algorithm's like, oh, this movie that they like, this genre, new movies coming out, they're going to the movies. Now, this is clearly not what's going to happen. The neighbor is right. The neighbor doesn't have access to any of this historical data, but the neighbor is right. And so this is what's called the broken leg problem, that there are always these types of corner cases that humans can detect that algorithms will never be able to detect, or at least we have no understanding of how that's going to happen in the near future. The problem is that humans have a tendency to think that everything is a broken leg, that everything is an exception. And now there's this balance. Like, how do you know? Are you looking at the exceptional case, or are you actually looking at the typical case? And this is just very, very difficult. The algorithm doesn't know. The human doesn't know. So what are you going to do? And we don't know what the answer is either. We have, I get this question all the time. What is that trade-off? How do we make these decisions? I don't know.
And that sounds, it makes you nervous about a closed system anytime soon, especially in criminal justice.
Yeah, so I do think that we realistically need to have human intervention, a human override. My intuitive sense, though, is that it shouldn't be used very often.
This is The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. I'm speaking with Sharad Goel about criminal justice and other things that relate to bias in human decision and human behavior. So you have done a lot of other things, and I want to make sure we hit them. And one of the things you've written about is echo chambers and the filter bubble. And so those are just great phrases. And so tell me about echo chambers. I think I have a rough idea of that. And what's this idea of a filter bubble, and why should we care about all of this?
Yeah, so what's an echo chamber? I mean, Stanford is a great example of an echo chamber, inside of an echo chamber, inside of an echo chamber, inside of an echo chamber. So the idea is that we're surrounded by people who believe things that are similar to us. And so the sad reality is I almost always interact with people who are so similar to me on so many dimensions that it's hard for me to actually be exposed to ideas that are fundamentally different from my own. Again, maybe that's, this makes me a little bit happy. I get kind of grumpy when I go home and like interact with people who fundamentally disagree with my politics. So there's actually a reasonable question there. Should we be interacting with people who have these super different ideas than our own? I think it's not obvious, but in some fundamental sense, we do believe that we should have a little bit of diversity in the types of ideas that we hear. So echo chamber is just a very simple idea that we say something and then we just hear that echo back and forth around the people that we interact with.
And it's a phenomenon in social media.
So echo chamber
a lot of attention.
So it's gotten a lot of attention in social media, but this is something that people have been talking about for decades, far before the internet. This is something that you can imagine, again, I actually spend very little time on the internet, but I'm still surrounded by people who believe almost all the exact same things that I believe. And so this is an echo chamber that's completely disconnected from online world. Now, the filter bubble is a refinement of this idea that the key is that it's algorithms, these online algorithms, that are curating the information that we see. For example, think Facebook feed, think any of these types of algorithms that are just showing us information. We say they're filtering that information, and now this is exacerbating these types of filter bubbles, these types of echo
So where does the
chambers.
bubble come? Because I think about bubbles and I think about popping them, like the tulip bubble. So why do we call it a bubble?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question.
All right.
Do you know the answer to this?
No. So you've studied these, though,
Yeah.
and you've made observations. Are there remedies? Are there machine learning or AI remedies? So you could imagine, are the people who are writing these what you might call flawed algorithms, are they regretting the algorithms, or are they doing exactly what they wanted, and this is a huge victory for them?
So I think it's hard to fix something if you don't know what the problem is. And this goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, that it feels somehow wrong to only be exposed to similar ideas, and that algorithms might be giving us some non-representative view of the world. Same time, it's not obviously bad. We don't know that, what is a counterfactual? What are we actually what would we rather see? And I don't think anyone actually knows the answer to that. So if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, how do you design an algorithm to do that thing? And this is actually so I did this work, I don't know, a few years ago, and then a bunch of people started calling me up and saying, hey, well, what should we do? And I was like, I have no idea. And so then I was like, okay, this is too hard. So I started doing something else.
So you could measure it and you could show that it was true.
Yeah.
I believe in one of your papers that I reviewed briefly, you had said that there was a somewhat unexpected exposure to alternative views that sometimes creeps into an otherwise very tight filter bubble.
Yeah, so this is what's interesting. So these online outlets like Facebook, there is this extreme algorithmic and also by our choices of who we decide to friend, it puts us inside this bubble. But at the same time, you're friends with people who you might not be friends with in your regular offline life, your friends from high school or your friends from other spheres of your life who actually might have different perspectives. And so this can go both ways. And most of the time, you're seeing these conforming views, but then some of the time, you're actually exposed to these ideas that you almost certainly would not be exposed to in the regular, everyday life, the people that you're talking with. So it actually cuts both ways. And this is this funny phenomenon of social media. And again, it's not totally clear if this is good or bad. You see all this online vitriol, in part because we're interacting with people with diametrically opposed views to our own. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's a good
I wish
thing
I had
to
a
have.
dime for every one of my wife's uncles that she's unfriended on Facebook because of what they say on the. So the other thing that I know you've worked on, which is fascinating, is online opt-in surveys. So there's online surveys all the time. Sometimes they're fun. You press some buttons and they show you a graph. You actually looked at this in a serious way.
Yeah, semi-serious way.
Okay,
so
let's call it serious. So what was the motivation and what did you find?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all surveys are opt-in surveys. I mean, when's the last time that you got a call from a number you didn't recognize and you actually picked it up, and then someone's like, "Oh, I'm a surveyor," and then you're like spent the next hour talking to them.
Right.
So that doesn't happen. So all surveys are opt-in surveys. I mean, that's just like we have to put that out there. So the idea of a representative survey, it doesn't exist anymore. But what we did is something even more extreme. We're saying, can we run surveys on these gaming platforms? And so we looked at Xbox. Well, we put out the survey, and we said, take the survey if you want to take the survey. What proportion of people do you think were men on that survey?
Like 98.
95%, pretty good guess. So probably some of them were like. So we did this, and you're like, okay, well, how can you learn anything from a survey that is so clearly non-representative of the general population? And so then we developed these statistical techniques to account for these differences, and we ended up making predictions about the 2012 presidential election.
I was going to say, now this gets very serious because you're looking at prognosticating elections.
Yeah. And our predictions actually ended up being pretty good. And so, maybe this is luck. It's always hard to know. You make one prediction. It's like, how do you know if you do happen to get it right or if there's something there? But it demonstrated that there's this promise to using these highly non-representative samples of data to make predictions. And the reality is we don't have any other choice. That's all we have.
Yeah, that's very exciting because there are many places in life where you're not going to get a random sample. And if you have well-validated methods to unbias, here's that word again, to remove these effects from the data set, that could be very powerful. So this sounds like a very serious kind of future area. Is it still an active area in the lab?
So we, I'm always kind of drawn back and forth into politics. I mean, sometimes I have this like love-hate relationship with politics. Sometimes I can't watch the news for like weeks, but then I just like have to get back into it. And so it's still an active thing that we do. Fantastic.
Thank you for listening to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman. If you missed any of this episode, listen anytime, on demand, with the SiriusXM app. Thank you. That was great. Fantastic. Thank you very much. And now we're going to have time for questions. There are a couple of microphones. I'll remind you, Jeremy, Sharad, you don't want to ask me a question. And two mics there. And I'll try to be very fair in selecting the questioners. Do we have any hands up? There's one in the back.
This one's for Sharad. In the experimental work that you did on the police stopping drivers, I was curious what you found out from those studies that you didn't expect.
So this is a good question. So I try not to form expectations whenever I do research anymore. And it's, it takes a lot of discipline. And so, for example, like when we were going in, and it's like kind of natural to think, oh yeah, there's going to be lots of bias, and in fact, the answer was there was bias. But we try to like tell ourselves stories of saying why there might not be bias, and these are like kind of casual stops, and maybe the stories that we hear about these egregious cases, they don't actually apply to these everyday situations. And I think it's like useful to tell oneself these types of stories just to make sure that you're really like digging into the data every time, and you don't just like see the result that you expect and then you like stop there, but like try to keep that type of skepticism. And so in some ways, it's like everything is supposed to be a surprise and nothing is supposed to be a surprise, and that we're like always trying to figure out, is this for real? Is it not for real? So that's maybe not the greatest answer to that question, but that's like how I try to think of research, is like try to like limit the amount of surprise that I have.
Just statistically, you must have found super fair policemen.
Well, we did not look at individual level outcomes. So it's actually so people. This is people always want us to be like, give me the top 10 list, and top 10 either by location. I mean, everyone wants that. It's like, give me the top 10, worst cities, and officer level. But that's not the sort of things that our type of analysis can reliably give you.
Probably Professor Weinstein, but any of you that want to answer. When I started my career in 1970, technology assessment was a big area. Figure out the implications, and it was inferred that we'd ban some technology because it didn't make any sense. So what's happened to that? Have we actually banned any technologies? Does anybody even think of that now?
Cloning babies is on the outs right now.
Yeah, I mean, it was, but of course,
But then
what
somebody did
actually
it.
happens, right? And I think, this I think is the real challenge. This is why, for me, it's so important to actually be teaching about these issues and to force that kind of critical examination of the impacts of technology, the ways that they can be misused, dual use kinds of issues. Because even if your intentions are good, it doesn't mean anyone else's intentions are good. And so we have lots of examples in the history of scientific development of the creation of technologies that are in the end used for purposes that they weren't originally intended. And we can create norms, right? And that was the effort around sort of cloning babies, to create a set of norms among people who had access to this technology, that they wouldn't do these things, and even still they were violated. When we look at, say, the creation of the regulatory environment around nuclear weapons, right? It was often nuclear scientists who were at the forefront of being concerned about misuse once they'd created a technology that they couldn't put back in the box, which is why we have former Secretary of Defense William Perry sort of pushing to try and get back to zero. No nuclear weapons anywhere in the world, because what's been unleashed by the nuclear age is so dangerous. And so if we don't have a set of technology, let me put it another way. If we have a set of technologists whose perspective is that it's someone else's problem to think about dual use issues, to think about potential harmful consequences, what autonomous systems mean for other people's jobs and the like, or what social media platforms do to patterns of political interaction and engagement, if they see that as someone else's job, then ultimately we're going to be in a position where when something goes horribly wrong, the pushback will be one that sets us back even further than if we engage these as critically minded citizens in a common environment in real time.
I did misspoke. They weren't cloned. They were CRISPR'd.
Right.
There's a technical difference, but ethically there's not much of a difference. In the back, do we have, raise your hand so I can, who has the mic? Okay, so we'll have here and then we'll do one on the right next.
What are the risks of technology gone awry or kind of taking over with other countries trying to get into the United States' systems, say other countries such as China or Russia going into the future, since this is the future of everything?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that this is something that as a national security policymaker was at the forefront of our minds, right? And before we even get to a world that Sharad is envisioning of algorithms making all sorts of decisions. I was glad to hear he wants to keep humans in the loop. I'm a fan of keeping humans in the loop also for some of the reasons that he described. Even before we get to that world, just think about how dependent we are in our everyday life on access to systems that are vulnerable, right? And so, I mean, even GPS devices, think about what happens to our ability to carry out military operations and to defend the country in the absence of our GPS satellite positioning systems that not only are in your phone, but are at the root of all of our technologies that enable us to point weapons in particular directions and fly airplanes and the like. So we have a society that is entirely dependent on a set of systems that are vulnerable. And if you want to make the problem even worse, recognize the fact that protecting those systems is not really the responsibility of government. Or you could say it is the responsibility of government, but government actually doesn't have the capability or the resources to set in place those protections. So the cyber attack on Sony was a perfect example of that's a hugely consequential offensive cyber operation against a major company, sort of in the United States, but it wasn't the government's responsibility to protect Sony, or was it, right? It was Sony's responsibility as a company protecting its own infrastructure. And so you can think about our dams, you can think about systems that we have to manage traffic, air traffic, rail traffic, our electric power grid. And so then if you move in the direction that we're also making a set of societal decisions via algorithms that also have these vulnerabilities, you can imagine the opportunities that that creates for adversaries to have effects on society, which perhaps the US would not pursue because we have a set of normative or ethical principles about how we use offensive military operations, but other societies might. And they'd be willing to inflict harm on our civilian population that would leave us very vulnerable.
How do you think about ethics related to the intervention programs, be it the migration or influence judges? We run the experiments, but these are real lives that we're impacting, whether we help or harm or fail to help, and that this impacts them for potentially a lifetime.
You want to start?
Yeah, I think this is exactly the question that you have to ask, and there's no easy answer to it. I think there's no technical solution, and this is something that I struggle with. It's actually very hard with my students because most of them are technically trained, and one common perspective is that technical students will come in and they'll just build the algorithms, then they'll pass it off, and now the policymakers have to make all the tough choices. But in reality, what happens is you build these types of tools, the policymaker is going to ask you what to do. And they're going to rely on you to guide them. And that means that all this ethical responsibility is really coming down on you as well. And we don't really know. We don't have a formal way of thinking about it. I mean, in the end, we're just trying to weigh costs and benefits. We say, well, if we were to roll out this algorithm as opposed to this, as opposed to no algorithm, we make predictions about what's going to happen. And then that's all we have. And so I think about ethics in a very pragmatic sense. It's like consequentialist sense of literally what's going to happen if we go one of these three different routes. And to me, that's about as far as I ever make it in these types of discussions.
So I want to add one additional thing to Sharad's response to your question, which is sort of challenge you to imagine the counterfactual in some sense, in which government or a nonprofit or an international organization or philanthropy or private sector is intervening in some way in the world in the absence of a partnership with a scholar, right? Making choices that have real consequences for people. What is the constraint that weighs the costs and benefits of those choices? One of the virtues of bringing an academic into the partnership and sort of rooting this in a kind of research paradigm where we think about effects of different treatments in the same way that you would in medicine is that we actually have an institutional review board, a set of guidelines, a set of norms that govern how we weigh these costs and benefits and how we enumerate them explicitly. So, in my prior work, sort of on global poverty issues where we run all sorts of randomized controlled experiments in Africa when we're thinking about how to improve human health or how to increase access to education, et cetera. We do all of those things governed by a rigorous ethical oversight process in a way that you don't have at the US Agency for International Development or the World Bank for that matter, where they're making those judgments and weighing those costs and benefits. They're experimenting on human beings every day, right? That is what governments and nonprofits and philanthropies and the private sector do. And at least when we bring it into the university environment, we are self-conscious enough about the potential effects of the things that we do to hold ourselves to a set of standards where we weigh these costs and benefits explicitly. And if we see harmful effects, we pivot, right? That's actually our obligation to stop what we're doing. But you don't see other organizations held to those same high standards.
We'll have one here and then one over here.
Last week in Science magazine, there was an interesting article on what to me was a new field of research, and that is trying to find ways to influence artificial intelligence systems so they make the wrong decision. And I suppose you could argue that that will help to defend artificial intelligence systems if we know how they can be corrupted. But I just wonder what you think about the ethics of that field of research.
It's pretty interesting. So, well, I mean, I think there are a couple answers here. I mean, first, I think it is useful to carry out. So I think we do have some, because, for example, if researchers aren't looking into it, someone else is going to be looking into it. And now I think it's uncomfortable to be proposing these methods to defeat algorithms. But the reality is, if we don't do it, that's not going to solve the problem. And so I do think there's an ethical responsibility to actually carry out the work. But I think it also raises this question of, is it ethical to deploy these types of black box algorithms that can be fooled in these ways, in these high stakes decisions? And a lot of our recent work has been in what's called interpretable machine learning, where we're trying to move away from black boxes into these systems that can't be easily fooled, and then they're relatively transparent in how they're making these decisions. And so that's what we're proposing in the judicial context, in these other high stakes contexts, because we are quite concerned about these types of adversarial attacks.
For those of you who didn't see this, a typical example is the bad guys can take an image of a stop sign and just change a few pixels so that a human still says, that's a stop sign, but the AI system now doesn't recognize it as a stop sign, and so the car continues driving right through the stop sign and bad things happen. That's just one simple example on the image analysis side, where these non-intuitive things can be created, and then you have these defeating of the algorithms, just as one example. Do we have a question here? Other questions here?
So all this is in E.M. Forster's 1909 book, The Machine Dies. I recommend it. A question about AI systems and the decisions that they make. I recently myself had an experience with an AI system that misinterpreted a satellite picture, so I don't have insurance. What about the human control or intervention in AI, particularly as it's provided by a private industry outfit? But in general, how do you prevent widespread, not just individual impact from an AI mistake? Where do you get past statistics and into one by one?
Because it wouldn't be good to petition the AI. They run the same algorithm, it has the same answer, and they say petition denied. That would not be good.
Yeah. I think this is a good question. I mean, but a related question is, how do you petition the human, or how do you avoid these human mistakes? And the reality is that often you can't. Like in theory, but oh, this is a human, I can reason with him. But really, they're worse in the black box, that they're just like somewhere, and you have no real idea of why they made the decisions they made, or even how to reach them. And so I don't think we have the right answer. We don't, and there is going to be some human in the loop. I think that's essential. But the balance is hard. The more you rely on the human, the more you're going to let these types of implicit biases creep in, and these other just random variations creep in. The more you rely on the algorithm, the more it's going to be rigid, and other sorts of problems are going to occur. So there is this balance, and I think this is one of the biggest open problems in all this algorithmic-aided decision-making, is finding that balance. I just don't think there's like a universal answer.
Yeah, this is one of the issues that we put squarely to students in this new computers ethics and public policy course, not just to demonstrate that they could come up with some predictive algorithm, right, but then to be aware of its potential limitations, how it might interact in the world, and what could go wrong. And the standard language that we have around solutions to these problems right now are, let's have transparency about what the algorithm is doing, let's make sure it's fair according to some criteria that we explicitly collectively decide, and let's ensure that there's some accountability for the algorithm, which could be a function of auditing the algorithm done by some independent third party, whether it's government or some alternative, and some due process for people who feel that the decision made, whether algorithmically aided, right, or algorithm, on its own, can be challenged in some way. But when you dig beneath the details of each of those things that I just described, they fall apart, right? So transparency is great, but if you're talking about a convolutional neural net, this gets to interpretable machine learning, like the people who are creating them don't even know what's going on. So the idea that the judge is going to have any idea of what's being generated for him is fanciful. But even if you were making available this information, what's the likelihood that the average citizen would be able to understand that information and make use of it, right? When you think about fairness, how many definitions of fairness are there that you sort of engage in your paper, right? Yeah. Like, 20 plus definitions of fairness, and you can't meet all of them. So someone has to make a decision, right, about what we mean when we say fairness in an algorithm, and that's something that's actually a political decision. And when it's a political decision, that means it's a function of who has power and who doesn't have power, who has voice and who doesn't have voice. And when it comes to accountability, right, and the auditing of algorithms, right, these are all things that are fundamentally political enterprises where we have unequal access to representation, to knowledge, right, and then you're going to have distributional harms. And again, this is why all of these things are about politics, right, about the set of choices. Technologists might like to make these decisions on their own, but as Sharad described, when all is said and done, especially if you're thinking about intervening in the world around problems that are collective problems, they're not going to be solved by technologists alone because we have to make some choices about what we value and what we're willing to trade off.
I think we have time for one last question. Is that correct, producers? One last question.
Thanks. So I'll try to make it a good one. So back in the 70s, a few of us in computer science were experimenting with something new that was called email. And there's an aspect of it that hadn't been brought out in current discussions that I wanted to ask about. So within about a month of the invention of email, we noticed something called flaming. And this erupted, and it was a big surprise to everybody. And all of a sudden, the messages that people were getting were much more emotional and so on than we had ever experienced in our life before. And I noticed this later on when my wife started using email 30 years later, and she was dealing with somebody else, and she would get very frustrated with these people. But you talk to them in person, it's never happened. And so it seems to me that this way of communication, partly anonymous, partly that you're not using body language, was making people much more vituperative, et cetera. And I wonder if there's any explanation of this and maybe some technical fix that would go the other way.
I think it's a perfect example of an unanticipated consequence of the interaction of technology and human beings, right? Where you think you know what you're designing, right? And you roll it out in the world, and you see how people, sort of act in an environment where they can be more anonymous, where they don't have to deal with the discomfort of having acted in a particular way. They can't read sort of, body language, and that's an early example. But we're experiencing that every day with every new startup that's being created, every new technology that's being rolled out, sort of unanticipated consequences. And sometimes the unanticipated consequences may be wonderful things, right? So I spent 3 months in South Africa a couple years ago, and it used to be really difficult to get around South Africa without your own transport and to do it safely. But now Uber is there, and what Uber has done is basically employ a bunch of Zimbabweans who've taken refugee status in South Africa because they've had difficulty accessing the South African labor market. What an amazing economic return for these Zimbabweans who were living on the margins of existence. But yet, what a terrible outcome, in fact, for the South African taxi drivers who can't afford to buy their own private car, in this environment, and are instead driving minibus taxis that, lots of people are now in the kind of lower to middle class are shifting over to the Uber vehicles. So the Zimbabweans are doing very well, and these other folks aren't. And so, we're just seeing these kinds of things play out everywhere, either in terms of how human beings interact with technology specifically, which was your email example, or just what societal consequences are. And, one of the perspectives that I've seen some of our technology students take comfort in is, well, you can't possibly anticipate the effects of technology, so we should blitz scale. We should start and go fast and experiment, and then we'll iterate. And I think we kid ourselves when we suggest that you can't think hard and anticipate any of these effects. You absolutely can anticipate effects. They won't always be realized. But then you can definitely measure effects, and then when you're aware of effects, you can definitely respond to them. But whether the incentives are there to respond to them is going to be a function of what the North Star is of a company, who a company is accountable to, whether policymakers are educated, and whether citizens give a damn.
Well, with that, I want to thank Sharad and Jeremy for a fascinating discussion. And this ends the formal portion of the Future of Everything, and I'm throwing it back to the Dean.
Very briefly, thank you so much, Russ, Sharad, Jeremy. This was a great discussion. So many vexing problems to think about, and I think a demonstration of why Stanford is a great place to think about them. We have medicine, engineering, and social science here on the stage, all sharing a language to talk about these problems. So I hope that you will stick around and talk about these issues and anything else with us this evening. We're serving dessert, and thank you so much for coming.